If I had a nickel for every time a Japanese Imperial Navy Vice Admiral with a vastly superior surface force lost his nerve and failed to attack a poorly defended and vulnerable American transport fleet, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. And at least Vice Admiral Mikawa has the saving grace of having inflicted the worst US Navy defeat in decades at the Battle of Savo Island, whereas Kurita has no such saving grace. He completely choked at the Battle off Samar, and the question is, why did he choke so bad? What factors led to this complete and utter disaster that we now know as the Battle off Samar, or more specifically the Imperial Japanese Navy's performance at that battle? So what's interesting, or perhaps fortunate for our purposes, is that Takeo Kurita was one of the few, relatively few, commanding officers who saw combat that survived the Pacific War, and, as a matter of course, he was interrogated by the United States Navy upon the conclusion of the war. And so we have his testimony a couple of years after the actual conflict, but we have his testimony on what he saw, what he felt, and how he decided on making that disastrous course of action. Of course, it is unfair to use hindsight to criticize the decisions of people at the time who had no idea about the wealth of information that we have now. Even from that standpoint, it's still pretty disastrous and sometimes unfathomable, the decisions that he made. So let's have a look at the kind of tactical decision-making and presumably ideas that went through his head at the time. For context, let's remember that at the time he had no idea that he was going up against a couple of lightly armored escort carriers and destroyers and destroyer escorts. He was under the impression, the incorrect impression, that he was going up against fleet carriers and heavy cruisers and battleships. So what he does is he first has this great idea to outspeed the US carriers, get upwind of them, and then attack them from upwind. So if they wanted to launch or recover their planes, the carriers would have to steam into the surface forces. That in and of itself makes sense, except for the fact that he would have known that the fleet carriers are faster than his own surface ships, and so it would have been pretty difficult for him to actually outmaneuver and cut off any US fleet carrier task force. Now, it was possible in theory because he was facing off against escort carriers, but again, he didn't know that. In fact, he didn't even know what kind of carriers he was facing. He did see masts, and he saw islands on the starboard side, so that gives him some idea of what he's facing. But again, given what he knew, he should have found it impossible to actually outspeed and cut them off. And so with these goals, he orders individual full speed ahead. Now what that means is that the ships are not steaming in formation in any kind of tactical formation. Instead, they're each individually pursuing the US Navy task force at full speed. And that means that the Yamato is going at 26 knots, you have Haruna going on at 25 knots, and the Nagato at a incredibly slow 24 knots, which is almost 10 knots less, I believe more than 10 knots less than the US fleet carriers could make at the time. So here is the real mind-boggling part, where he says that the reason he did not make a concerted attack and instead ordered this individual general attack is because he didn't think it was possible to make a formation attack. Why? It's not clear, and to be honest, I don't even think with hindsight you can explain any possible reason that he would think it impossible to organize and consolidate his forces and then attack. Although he does mention a couple of obstacles, mostly in the form of the fighter bombers and torpedo planes of TACV 3, attacking them piecemeal and each time forcing his formation to scatter and thereby increasingly disrupting his formation, if he had any, as the battle went on. Also important are the considerations that led to his premature retreat, even though if he had pushed the attack, presumably, in hindsight, he could have inflicted pretty major damage on the assembled US transports and light escorts that were present. The big one, of course, is that he really didn't have the information we have now. Number one, he had no idea that almost the entirety of the US warships assembled had gone off after the Northern Decoy Force. He also lacked information about what exactly the Southern Force and Northern Forces were doing, aside from a couple of scattered intelligence reports that he had received over the wireless. And so his intention was to go north and rendezvous with Ozawa and continue night attacks from there if at all possible. And his impression was that had he gone on to Leyte, he would have just gotten destroyed by waves and waves and waves of US both carrier-borne and land-based aircraft. Now, this in and of itself is not actually unreasonable. So he says that he intercepted a message, which read, quote, "We are under attack by Japanese ships hasten with aid," and he was under the impression that the aid would not be forthcoming for 2 hours. And once those 2 hours had passed, it made sense to him that there would be this aid, which he expected in the form of air raids, to be bearing down upon him at any moment. So the decision he made was not particularly unreasonable based on the information he had available at the time, but also the information he had available at the time wasn't that good, and part of it was his own fault. So the interrogator asks if the reason for going north was the threat of heavy air attack. Kurita responds that it wasn't a question of destruction, that was neither here nor there. It was a question of what good I could do in the bay. I concluded that under the heavy attack from ship and shore-based planes, I could not be effective. Therefore, on my own decision, I concluded it was best to go north and join Admiral Ozawa. So I suppose what this proves is the sheer tenacity and skill of the aviators of Taffy 3, that they made this entire enormous surface force, which really had no business losing to Taffy 3, that they were under attack by concerted and heavy air attack from fleet and shore-based planes. And of course, it wasn't just Taffy 3, but that was the main bulk of what Kurita saw. So here, Kurita makes an additional point about intelligence. It was his understanding that at the point that the Battle of Samar had ended, he had missed his opportunity because the US transports had already finished unloading their cargo, and so it wouldn't really make much sense to sink a bunch of transports that had been done transporting. It'd just be empty ships. There's not really much use in using ammunition and eventually expending your force attacking empty transports. So he was going more for an open ocean battle, and his reasoning was that he would have a better opportunity to maximize the use of his ship's maneuverability out in the open ocean rather than the confines of a bay. So all in all, his decision to retire was not particularly unfounded, nor was it particularly disastrous. What's more baffling is his decision in the first place to not attack in an organized manner. He sighted the US ships, or he sighted the masts thereof at least, at around 35,000 meters according to his own memory, which is consistent with the US reports. And he says that he was preparing to change formation, and he implies that sighting these ships immediately eliminated his ability to do so, which is dubious because according to his memory, he opened fire at around 32 to 33,000 meters. So it appears that the linchpin of this disaster was the decision to go full steam ahead individually until the loose formation of ships could get upwind of the US Navy carriers, at which point presumably he was planning to sort of form into a general formation and then make a concerted attack from there. This was hampered of course by the fact that he expected air attack, and so the ships were somewhat scattered to prevent a single air attack from devastating the entire force, which again, given what he knew, makes sense, but in hindsight is completely ludicrous because Taffy 3's planes didn't even have the bombs or torpedoes to make an actual decent attack because of the loadout they were carrying. So what can we learn from Vice Admiral Kurita, the choke artist of Leyte Gulf? Number one, intelligence. You have to have intelligence, and not like smartness obviously, but you have to have information on the enemy disposition as well as the location of your own forces. Number two, it's true that no plan survives contact with the enemy, but you have to have a plan in the first place. Your plan can't just be full steam ahead until you get into an advantageous position, because then you won't get to that position in the first place. Number three is that in many cases, general organization is much more important than an advantageous location, especially if you're going up against a force that you believe to be on par with yours or even superior. Now, even with the intelligence available at the time, Kurita was willing to give up 50% of his force to inflict commensurate casualties on the US Navy task force. Had he been more aggressive, he could have repeated Mikawa's performance off Savo Island and inflicted a notable defeat late in the war. Instead, he choked, and he gave us the worst performance of a heavy surface force against destroyer escorts.